Caddis Maximus here, this time with a review of some World War II era Wright tools out of Barberton, Ohio. Wright tools never sold out and actually tightened their belts and really pressed on their sales force and have stayed around. Like Lyle Tools, surprisingly enough, this is one of those old American tool companies that still is privately owned. You can get these tools. It turns out that Home Depot has a commercial supply division called Whitecap, and they're all over the United States, kind of like Fastenal. And they actually stock in those, they're, you know, a commercial supply store, but they do stock Wright tools. I don't know if they'll deal with the warranty, but in this case, when the warranty is still valid. Bought these your grandfather bought these 3 generations ago, and the warranty would be just as valid today as it was then. They probably would warranty these if you just said, the anvil's really loose on a ratchet, and you told them, well, it's from 1946. They probably just warranty that out of you having a ratchet that's still in this nice a condition. So the ratchet was obviously the most expensive portion. I would think that in today's 2020 dollars, I only found 13 pieces at this garage sale, but I was really stoked. It probably was a 20-piece set or something around there. I mean, in 1946, it was probably 35 or 50 bucks, which would have been, $250 or so now, maybe $300, kind of expensive. Wright tools, as far as, overall from the ones that I have seen, is they're really good for the quality, especially because they're American made. They've never been like trying to say that they're, they always say that every tool company thinks their tools are the best, but they never really were like trying to really compete against, they were competing against Snap-on and Proto. But Proto and Snap-ons were great, but they just charge you an arm and a leg then and now. Proto was always pretty good, but they were always pretty expensive, being the LA tool company. And Wright tool was always just priced lower than Snap-on and Proto, and basically gave you the same quality. And it's pretty obvious that that was their intention 75 years ago, and it appears to still be the case today. Really, a lot of their tools are like Napa Carlisle retail prices. They're totally reasonable prices. In this set, I was pretty lucky. All these are 46 or 1945 with the date stamps there. They stopped doing that in the 1980s. The spinner handle, the sliding T-handle breaker bar. One of the interesting things is Wright roll stamps and then grinds the handle. So on the breaker bar, it's great. But using that method, say on the sockets, ends up meaning that the stamping gets a little bit light, just a little bit hard to read sometimes. And so they probably shouldn't have done that on the sockets. But in this situation, you get a really nice tight-fitting handle, and you don't have to worry about this jamming up. Tools that stand the test of time are obviously extensions. People don't use speed wrenches as much. But spinner handle, breaker bars, sliding T-handles, those have been what they've been for 100 years, except for they were a bit small in the old era. This, we can see the forks have been spread a little bit. It's pulling out the rivet. One of the reasons they use the screws, because it actually provides more holding power from the fork spreading versus doing this riveting. The rivet would need to have really big bulbous heads on the outside to support it. And obviously the forks just aren't particularly thick, and they're much thicker on modern tools. So that has improved in modern days. But back then it was still an extension. I do like that. The sliding T-handle was always supposed to be the breaker bar. This is for, it's really stubborn. This is getting a little too much for this. I'll use the sliding T-handle, as well as being able to stop in the middle and then being able to spin out a fastener pretty fast if you have that kind of space. One thing that's not done on modern T-handles, or not from all, like Proto, I don't think does it yet, which is make this little cutout on the head. And I will say it's a pretty thick head. That cutout is to trap the ball bearing, so if you have something like an extension on it, when you're reaching in certain, awkward situations, you don't have to worry about the head flopping around. You can lock it in place. And I thought that's a good feature, and surprisingly enough, not everybody does that. One of the reasons that the T-handles are so good at breaking bolts is just because they don't have a flex in them. They're really designed to be very rigid, and so they deliver the force more directly onto the fastener. And you'll really notice a lot of times if you have a T-handle, you use it, it seems easier to break a bolt. At least in my experience, it's been that way. We have these extensions, which are not too bad. What's interesting is these are really evident of their manual manufacturing process. This will come out as like a rod stock, and then they'll heat up both ends red hot and squish them in a little bit so it makes like these big bulbous areas. That's how they forge the receiver and the output. Then they'll just put them between forging dies and slam down. Put one end in, slam it down, pull it out, and the next set of dies, slam it down. I can't tell if they've actually cut or milled the square, or if that's just the raw square from when they do the forging process. It's a little easier to see that evidence here because we have this forging line. If something's cast, that line will be very thin, because if it's cast, then the molds need to be tight. Otherwise, whatever liquid, metal, or plastic you're pouring into them will, of course, leak out. Forging is different because you're taking a hot piece of metal, and sometimes cold. It doesn't even have to be hot, and you're physically crushing it between two molds that are the rough shape, but they're very expensive because obviously they have to be made out of tool steel as well because they're forging tools. And so they are always sized just a little bit too small. They don't come quite together so that crams against all the little metal crystals and spreads them out in the direction that of the final part, helping increase strength along with heat treatment. So we can see where that happened here. This is where they sanded the forging flashing, but we can see that that flashing line does not line up with this end. So we know it's actually been forged on one end, pulled out, and then forged again. So it really is a two-strike, double forged extensions. You know, obviously nowadays, it's one of the things from older tools versus modern tools. Is older tools, it seems, one, maybe not so many super stuck fasteners, but I find that hard to believe. I think more it just seems things were more optimized, because obviously like the squares and stuff were just a little bit smaller, at least on these Wright tools, older ones, versus, you know, modern tools, which are really thick. I think what's happened is a lot of manufacturers have just said, you know, we know that they're going to twist and break, so we just make them all this extra thick. Where back then, it was more about taking care of the tools, and if this didn't work, then you went and got a 1/2 inch when you start feeling it twisting. And the second reason is just to be a little bit more efficient with materials. If these were made during World War II, or that's during the time period they're procuring materials, then tool steels were not going to be cheap. Now, many companies like Chrysler end up making tanks, where Wright hand tool companies continue just to do what they were doing, making hand tools, because those were all needed for all the manufacturing and then servicing overseas were hand tools. So they were also granted ability to purchase high-grade steels, which would be reserved for, you know, the military and the war effort. And so they considered hand tools a part of that war effort. And so they were able to get a hold of the tool steels, but they had to try to do what they can just to be a little more conservative. Anyway, let's get on to the Ratchet, because that's like the best part of this whole set. I only paid 20 bucks at the garage sale, and I thought that was amazing. The Ratchet's interesting because they manufacture it. You know, they quite a bit of forging, sanding on the column there. Then what they do is they actually assemble the machine it, assemble the top and bottom plate with the fasteners, and then sandblast it, as we can see here. But the tops of the fasteners are also sandblasted. That is same on this side, and then they take and they grind this outer peripheral edge. So this is going to be handmade, essentially a handmade ratchet. And what I was surprised is I ended up with a pretty good one, because with the handmade ratchets, you can really see the evenness of the grind. Usually this is beveled a little bit too much one way or the other. Other things that happen is this grind around the periphery just isn't very even, but somehow I really lucked out. We can see on the edges of the screws, it's turned out to be a very, you know, whoever made this had a really good day, obviously, because this is very symmetrical. This is an excellent example. What isn't excellent is there's quite a bit of anvil play in there, and I'll see if I can't fix this up. There's some shim washers here, and I'm going to try to get those in there and see if I can't tighten that up. Has a good ball detent. All the ball detents are still in all these tools, so we haven't lost any of those. It's a 20-tooth ratchet, so that's one click. Tension, I mean, holy mackerel. I mean, during normal operation, you're getting like 3 or 4 clicks, so that was an issue. Another thing is they have a curious design of this ratchet. I think one was due to simplicity, and two was to get around other pair head ratchet patents. So it has a double mechanism here. We have the switch, but unlike, you know, just a rocking pawl that's integrated under the switch, or even a floating pawl that you might flick with the switch, this is activating what is like a clock mechanism, this fork, and it either rotates it one way or the other, thus engaging the ratchet pawl. Let me go ahead and break this down. Before I do break it down, this is indeed the 1945 spinner handle. They aren't used much today, obviously, but I like spinner handles personally. And except for on this one, it has a couple issues with this Wright. And one is this handle is just the wrong shape, has pretty sharp edges. It's just too small. So when you're trying to do it, your fingers, it's just, you don't have a very good grip. Of all the shapes for a speed wrench, this is not one of them. But otherwise, it seems fine. The other issue is, unfortunately, they just didn't, you know, didn't get the hand size. I may have a little bit larger hands, but the problem here is this. It pinches right across the knuckles there. It's like, for me, this speed wrench is a no-go. It's like it pounds past my knuckles every revolution. Most other speed wrenches have just a bit more space in there, so I'm surprised Wright made that so compact. It just seemed just a little bit odd. You know, you just have this habit of wanting to grab it right where it's pivoting on the 90-degree angle, and man, it really racks my hand. Anyway, let me do a quick teardown of this ratchet here. Sure, you can't get a rebuild kit for this. They'll probably just send you I'm sure they just send you a new ratchet. Phillips head fasteners, even in 1946, annoying people for at least 75 years. Phillips had some good salespeople. What I do find also interesting is it's the plates on the top, not the bottom of the ratchet. It's also pretty well secured, because this screw right here is actually what takes the forces from the ratchet mechanism itself. The switch is just rocking it back and forth. So this big flathead screw is going to be an alloy tool steel screw, and we have to do that. And it also retains the top cover, so triple screwed top cover. It's also a little bit annoying to try to get this whole mechanism apart here without it ball bearings and everything else flying out. I did lubricate this. I'm gonna have to clean it up again, but very simple ratchet mechanism. There's our pawl, so when we rotate the lever, which is in a slot in the bottom of this plate, it just rotates this pawl back and forth and interacts right there with that, whoop, there goes our ball bearing, interacts with our anvil. So it's kind of like a clock mechanism. What I do find strange is they made this so coarse. I mean, there's plenty of material there. They could have added a few more teeth, because even in 1946, this was a coarse ratchet. Give you a close-up here and then finish this video out. We have 9 parts. We have the anvil, we have the lever, which actually looks like it's a little forged part, but when they were drilling the hole, they got a little close to the edge. There's a little peephole there. We've got the heavy-duty screw, which holds this lever, this anvil here, or excuse me, these ratchet pawls, which appear to be like high-speed steel or something. This is a very hard piece of steel. Our spring, our ball detent, those 2 Phillips screws. And then I was pleasantly surprised that this top plate is actually pretty thick. And I should have mentioned that the overall profile of this ratchet, which is this height here, is actually competitive. It still would be considered a low-profile ratchet today. This anvil, entirely manually machined. Just the teeth, as you can see, are just super coarse. And then, of course, I have my shim washer to deal with that anvil play. We can look at the engagement. And so how it works is how this pawl works is it's either rocked this way, and so you know, one direction is tightened, or it rocks this way and one direction is loosened. Even though it's one single pawl, it definitely has a lot of grip in there. It can take a lot of force. You can see it's a little bit dented right there from breaking fasteners, but it would take quite a bit of effort. I don't know if, to tell you the truth, I don't know if these teeth would strip or slip or if the anvil would twist off, but I'm sure it would hold up pretty darn good. A lot of machine work in this just because they have to come and plunge down 3 different size cutters and those 2 cross holes. This hole is where that big screw goes through, so it's got to be drilled and tapped. Quite a bit of work. In addition to the sanding, one thing I was going to mention is they knurled this before they sandblasted it. So when they sandblasted it, it sandblasted half the knurling off, so it's like a knurl. It's a textured knurl looking effect, but it doesn't provide a whole lot of grip. Super thick chrome plating though. Anyway, that was kind of a long video just talking about Wright tools. Interesting finding out some of their history, as well as talking about some World War II era tools and just how they were manufactured, what they look like, and especially when it's such a beautiful set like this. And it's always fun when it's from a company that's still around today and you can still get a warranty out of them 75 years later. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.